Hey, everybody. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to work through chapter 7, and then we will stop after that, and then we'll work through chapter 12. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So chapter seven's entire topics really surrounded economics. They surrounded pay. They surrounded poverty. And we're going to kind of get into some of all of that. I've added all sorts of little quirky political cartoons, not necessarily political cartoons, little cartoon, I guess those would be considered political cartoons, but little tidbits in there and lots of graphs and stuff to try to kind of help communicate some of these ideas. But first, let's get into a couple of terms. Social inequality is described in your book as a society's unequal distribution of wealth, income, power, and opportunity. Social classes are large groups of people who have similar income but also have similar education, job prestige, just general kind of economic wealth, etc. So it's not just necessarily categories of you make this income to this income, so you're in this social class, but it's also like, hey, you also have these social networking, you have this particular social experience, and that comes from a particular type of economic wealth or lack of wealth. Economy is the social institution that produces and distributes goods and services. Capitalism, which is currently the majority of the global economy, and specifically the type of economic system that runs into the United States. It is the current main global economic system that is focused on profits and where capital is invested into the market to garner more profit. So it's driven on this idea that you want to increase profit as much as possible through the reinvestment into either stocks in your company or continued growth of your company or continued resource allocation or cutting costs depending on what you are trying to facilitate, et cetera, et cetera. And then structural inequality is the inequality that is built into social institutions. National debt is the total amount that the US government owes. So they owe money depending on what they're paying out for social services, social security, things of that nature. But it's essentially the debt is the amount that is surplus, the amount coming in via taxes and input coming into the government for any kind of fees, anything that brings money into the government. Past that is going to be all the debt that they acquire, and that national debt is consistently growing currently. And then just an overall understanding that poverty is also structural. It is not just an inherent personal flaw, but it is something that is built into the system because you need people who will do things for cheap labor. You need, as part of capitalism, those who are not as economically prosperous, etc. All right, so let's go into pay and inflation. So when we talk about this, really what this graph is showing, and it would continue to show a disparity, but there's real income, which is essentially the income adjusted for inflation, as opposed to the income you make just as the number, right? So you're going to have the number. And while, yes, if you look at the 70s is what this graph shows to now, currently people technically make more dollar signs. However, when you look at the real income, which is essentially that adjusted for inflation, we are actually making less generally than 80% of what people were making when you adjust for inflation. And that number is probably even more dramatic now. But it consistently, there's a gap between how much individuals make and how much it is in adjusted for inflation, or how much it's worth essentially. And that worth problem, there's a disparity between the dollar signs you make and what those dollar signs could actually purchase or get for you. Again, poverty is a social problem. It's a social problem because it affects many people, and it also creates a system where homelessness can occur, health problems can occur, all these other crime, et cetera, all the social problems that we talk about can be and are related to class and economic status. Because the less you are able to engage economically in a society, the more likely you are to engage um, in other activities to garner your basic needs. Okay. So the cost of food consistently is astronomically going up. We all know this. We've all had conversations. We've heard the memes lately about eggs and their price, or we're constantly talking about gas prices. The cost of childcare, if you have a child or you plan to have a child, childcare is astronomically expensive. I worked in early childhood education for damn near close to a decade. I promise you it's not going to the people who work there. But the childcare, it can cost, and generally usually is costing more than people's mortgage a month in childcare, proportionately to uh, how many kids you have and the size of house you need, right? If you proportionally look at that, most people are spending with kids are spending more on childcare than they are on housing, which is insanity. The cost of housing, anyone who has tried to buy or is anywhere or has even noticed the housing market, currently it is very, very high. The last time it was getting high like this, we ended up having that bubble burst in the 2007, 2008 era of economic kind of um, issues. We'll go with issues. And that bubble looks like it may burst again in the near future because of just the extreme amounts that it continues to go up. All of these things, all of the ways in which how much food costs, childcare costs, housing costs, all of those things, and the level of income that you make determine how much aid you get, qualify for, and or are capable of, or whether or not you're capable of meeting. And that doesn't mean that you make this much money in dollar signs and that automatically equates to, hey, you are doing okay. You're doing well enough that you don't have to stress every time you get paid, etc. That's not what a poverty line is. A poverty line is literally this arbitrary line that we've created, and there's a poverty line level calculator that goes by state and policies, and you can look it up. But it is essentially the total family income divided by the poverty threshold, or it's called the ratio of income to poverty. And that's dependent on the social policies you have in place at a federal level, but also at a state level. And then the difference in dollars between family income and that family poverty threshold is called the economic deficit for families in poverty, or the economic surplus for families essentially over that line. So essentially, you're making this bare minimum line. Now, if you were in class and we were doing this in class, I would give you essentially the poverty line for whatever state we were in when we had this class. And I can still do that if you want me to. And then have you try to find all the resources you need, housing, food, etc., and see if you can do it for the amount of people you are allotted, because I'll usually divvy it out depending on if you're like just like, hey, here, you get to be a single person, or hey, you get to be a family of 3, etc. And then you have to try to make and survive a month's worth of bills on that income. I have very rarely had a student successfully be able to do this. And if they have cut out any kind of anything that is not basic needs, and usually are living in a place that is not very pleasant to be in. So again, a reminder that this doesn't mean you're in economic excess or even that you've hit working class. The poverty line currently is set up with, hey, you might be able to feed yourself this week. You may keep the lights on. You're definitely not paying medical bills. And if your car isn't functioning or the buses aren't running, you're SOL. Like you're not going to make it. So just FYI, that poverty line is very much not regulated for people to be stable. It's more of hopefully you're not homeless. That's essentially what it's trying to garner for you. All right. And the problem with creating a poverty line, or the ability to figure out where aid is needed, partly comes with this: how do we conceive poverty, right? What do we think of it as a society? And there's this biological poverty idea where poverty is so severe that it deforms or kills through malnutrition or starvation. And those are going to be those depictions of um, non-industrialized nations, and those kiddos that are like skin and bones trying to get, $1 a day or what have you to help feed them. Those are going to be kind of those situations, and that's going to be talked about in a different way than really having a conversation about where most in poverty is in industrialized nations. That's not to say that there are not people that are still that malnourished currently living in the United States. It's to say that at an institutional level, that is a rarity in um, in industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries. Relative poverty is this idea that we're comparing standards of living. Okay, and so that's more likely something that would garner more empathy, more equality, more equity within our system. And that's just essentially saying, okay, if you're living in a mansion down the street and I'm living in a box or a 1 bedroom apartment with 3 kids and myself working 3 jobs, and I still can't get enough food, or I still can't feed the baby, or I still can't buy the formula or the diapers, then right, we're comparing this person's living situation to this mansion on the corner, right? And there's a very realistic and very obvious disconnect between how one person is living, or how this particular group is living, comparatively to those who don't have enough access or don't have enough resources, right? And then you have official poverty, which is just the specified income level that separates the poor from the not poor. So that's going to be your poverty line when you talk about the United States. And that's, again, very subjective, and very rarely does it move for inflation in the ways that it probably should. And again, so we talked about ways in which the poverty line is not accurate, but it also isn't set up for a standard of living or quality of life. It's set up for meeting the very basic of basic needs. All right. So income and wealth and structural inequality. So I put this YouTube up here because this is where these particular graphics come from. And I'm going to explain those in just a second. But it's a super short little video, but it's super informative and it's really important. So I want you guys to try and watch that. I again will post all of these links that I talk about in these particular modules. I will post those little YouTube things in the lecture area. May not happen by tomorrow morning, but I will get those in there as soon as possible, probably by tomorrow evening late. Okay, so income is this idea that money that people receive for their work and investments. Wealth is the economic assets people have, so their savings, their bank accounts, their stocks, bonds, mutual funds, real estate. Now, even just looking at that idea of wealth, how many people can honestly say that they have stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and specifically a large amount of real estate, or even one single piece of real estate, right? And so that's kind of, again, talking about that gap and that understanding of what and who has the ability to acquire wealth. And again, that's getting into the next thing: who generally has access to wealth. And that's going to depend on a lot on social statuses, right? That's going to depend on generational wealth. That's going to depend on your social networking power. That's going to depend on your education level. There's a whole bunch of things that are that are part of who has access to these wealth options and who has the expendable economic means in order to acquire anything within those wealth category. So how does wealth give you power? So C. Wright Mills had this idea of this power elite, which is essentially the top military, political, and business leaders who make decisions that directly influence the country and even directly influence the world. And this has had multiple names. It's had the 1%. It's called the ruling class. It's been called several other names that are probably not as kind. But essentially, this is that group of people that head that are on the board of directors of 8 different companies, right? The major companies. These are the people who are economically more well off than most humans could possibly even think about, right? And it's talking about this idea that they're not necessarily sitting around a round table and having a conversation and saying, hey, we're going to make this policy, this in this country so that we can do this. But it's that social networking ability to have conversations at charity events or have conversations at particular um, social gatherings, or the ability to have enough in common that they're working for similar goals, even if those similar goals have absolutely no benefit for society as a whole and have more benefit for that particular group, right? And it's this, again, this idea was essentially really talking about the fact that there needs to be some conversation about who can lobby, where that money comes from, who has power to make bills, to write them, to enforce them, and how are they directly impacting everybody in society versus how are they impacting the particular people who are lobbying for them and or the particular very, very elite top class, right? Pluralists are these many interest groups that compete for world power. So they have more of an idea that, hey, we've got a whole bunch of different little pocket groups that have political power. And these pocket groups tend to compete or tend to bid for more and more power so that they can acquire this. Now, that's not to say you can't have both, that you can't have a ruling class that has little pockets in it that kind of debate over who gets to have what particular economic prosperity or what particular lobbying they want to do, etc. But it creates, again, this culture of wealth, this idea that wealth is specifically a social thing, a thing that you can embody, and a thing that you can be inherent to. And it creates, again, this disconnect between society as a whole and their economic resources versus those who maybe they serve or who they're supposed to serve as a society as part of a political or military leader. All right. Real quick, let's talk about these graphs. The top one, you're going to see that this is all the wealth. Say you have all the wealth in the United States or all the money possible in the United States. This is how it would be distributed for individuals. So essentially, this is how much that bottom 10% is going to be. This is going to be the bottom 20%. You're seeing like tiny amounts of resources, right? Tiny amounts of economic prosperity. Then you get into the next 20%, you're seeing a touch more, but like still that's tiny, right? And really you don't see this gap until you get up into or see really economic prosperity or more until you get to this 80% plus. And even the 80% to the 99%, right? That's still like you're going to stick that on top of there, right? And that's some serious economic wealth, right? But it's not even remotely comparative to the top 1% who holds 40% of all economic wealth. 1% of the population, 40% of the economic resources. That in and of itself should be a massive, massive red flag for those in this society, because that kind of economic power and that kind of economic prosperity makes such a gap between here and here. And what it does is create an entire group of people who have no means to be part of the same capitalist buying process as those right here, especially those right here. All right. So here's what America thinks the again, and this is just the let's try that again. Distribution of wealth in the United States. And so what most people thought when they were surveyed was that the top 20% had, roughly, let's see here. They had about 50% of it, right? Then you had, I don't know, probably about 5% going to the bottom 20, another 10% maybe to the second 20%. The middle class who are doing okay, they're maybe getting 15 or so, maybe 20%. And then you have again the primarily. So that already looks pretty icky, right? 90% of those people who chose an ideal landscape looked at it like this. So your top 20 still garnered more than your bottom 20, right? This isn't an equal distribution. You're still seeing more at the top, but it looks way better than this. Now, here's the kicker. This is what the actual distribution is of wealth in the United States. The top 20% garners so much. And then you have the next 20%, right? So this is the top 40% of the United States of wealth. This is the middle class, and you can barely even see the working class or the lower class. Like they're just barely there. If you can even call that there, right? If that wasn't a dark blue, you probably wouldn't see it. Like you can barely see this lighter blue. It's so tiny. And that's to say that's and the reason we point this stuff out is that if this is what the ideal is for most Americans, this is where they think it is, but this is where it really is. We need to start talking about how we can get back to this ideal, or how we can at least get to what we think it is, so that we can get to a place where there's some more economic equality. And this isn't equity by any stretch of the means. This is just, hey, it's probably more probable than equity would be, because we always know that the rich are going to have more than us, which is again inherent into that system, right? That's a message that we get from, it's why everybody strives for that American dream, right? Everybody strives to be at the top because you make more, you acquire more, you automatically get more than those at the bottom. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's happening in the ways that people think it is. And so again, these come from this particular video, which described them probably way better and more eloquently than I am. So please take a look at it. Again, it's super short and super informative. All right, so let's talk about who is in poverty. You're going to have a lot of your minimum wage workers, or those who work part-time jobs or several part-time jobs, because that minimum wage does not equal the ability to get to a standard of living or even the poverty line. If you look at by state, right, you're going to look at the green states are having troubles, and you're going to see a lot of that being in the South. You're going to see a lot of that being in regions where there are less economic institutions, less social welfare systems, more population, etc. When you look at those doing the best, you're going to see some of these northern states, a lot of the places up here in the Northeast that have a lot more regulation, a lot more social services. And then you have your middle ground, which is going to be a lot of your Midwest, and your West in general. And then it kind of goes up in here too. But again, that's going to show you essentially. And if you plug this in to, say, a political map or etc., you're going to see some striking resemblances. And that's something that we can talk about when we get into policy and change towards the end of the semester. But again, here's your race. And it does not, it does have Indigenous people on it. A lot of times they get left out of this conversation, even though they have the biggest percentage of impoverished people. This is something that we've, through historic measures, have created these systems, right? And so this is something that, as we talk about race, we will get into a little bit further. Disability is not something that's talked about, but a lot of people on disability or that have any kind of medical necessity or medical need end up very poor just due to medical costs, due to cost of care, due to inability to be productive in the ways that society expects you to be, et cetera, et cetera. Poverty is not generally a long-term situation, extreme poverty anyway. It's usually inherent to injury or illness, again, back to that disability, due to layoffs or due to unforeseen expenses, say a medical bill, say a having to be off for maternity leave, even, etc. And so these things can impact where you are on the poverty line or being under the poverty line. Again, so there's this culture of poverty idea, or this idea that there's an inherent built of laziness, or there's an inherent built of self-fulfilling prophecy as someone enters poverty and then is trying to exit it, where they give up. And it's got a lot of controversy. And a lot of that is because how are a lot of people that, or regions that were studied in this way or categorized in this way, also didn't have a lot of access to opportunities, access to maybe transit to get to jobs, or even jobs in general. Take, say, Appalachia for an example, right? A lot of people associate kind of this culture of poverty to regions like that. But if you take major industry that was there, major infrastructure that was there, let it crumble or let it disappear or take it away, and then expect those people all to be able to acquire the same level of jobs, the same level of economic prosperity without putting something back into that community, it's not possible, right? And so there is this idea and this I guess, social thing that happens where without that infrastructure, without those accessibility to options, there is this level of, well, I don't have enough money to be part of the system, and I don't have enough money to, or I don't have enough resources to access the system. So I'm just not part of it. I'm just going to give up on the system. Right. And that there is some of that, but it's not necessarily directed towards laziness as much as it is structurally inherent to how options work and access to options work. Now we're going to talk a little bit about homelessness. So there was a study done, and these were kind of the groups that this person, the author, particularly of the textbook, found in this homelessness study. I'm not going to say that I agree with every bit of this, but I will say that you could probably find any one of these categories in a homeless population, but I'm not going to agree with there's going to be a disparity in who is there and how much of the homeless population is particularly in any of one of these groups, if that makes sense. So there's the pushouts, and these are going to be people who are evicted. These are going to be people who maybe lost their job or economic resources, or even were, say, a marginalized group and were kicked out of their home, say a queer youth, or trans youth, or I'm thinking of other people, any kind of super religious home. Maybe someone got pregnant and it was earlier or out of wedlock, and that particular family does not approve, and so that person and her gets she gets kicked out while being pregnant, etc. You have victims of environmental disaster. That's going to be increasing. Environmental refugees is already something we have to talk about, especially as the same areas get hammered over and over and over again by, say, hurricanes or earthquakes or tsunamis. Just today, there was a 7.5 earthquake in Turkey that is causing massive devastation. And those people are going to have to go somewhere, right? And that's not necessarily going to have infrastructure or the possibility of being able to create infrastructure depending on the level of damage and how that particular landscape is after these ecological disasters, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that when we get into population as well. All right. You also have those with mental health concerns. I think that they worded that differently in the book. However, these are going to be maybe your vets that are not having post-traumatic stress treatment, but are having a hard time coming back into society in the ways in which it operates. These are going to be your elderly who may be experiencing memory problems or may be disoriented and not have necessarily people who can care for them or access to care, etc. These are going to be those who have maybe like things like schizophrenia or etc., who may not be able to access treatment or may not want treatment, right? those kind of individuals would all kind of fit into the same category. You're going to have the new poor, and that's just going to be, again, those that are very recently poor and are that way due to an unforeseen event or etc. And then you have the technologically unqualified, which again is part of that new poor. So you may have lost your job because you are being outsourced for someone, or your job now requires an educational level that wasn't possible or wasn't necessary when you got the job, etc. Or they're adding new machinery that you don't understand, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have the elderly. It's kind of self-explanatory. The runaways, the demoralized, and that's going to be those who, for any particular reason, are marginalized in society to the extent that they are not able to acquire any kind of economic hope, or even options. And these are things where people that are going to fall through the cracks of social services and any kind of assistance programs. And you have your alcoholics, you have your ease addicts, which is essentially they just want an easy place to stay. All of these particular ones at the bottom, again, are a reminder that this is not, I do not want you or anyone else to pivot homelessness in association with these last three categories. For while they do exist, they are much more rare than those at the top of this particular list. And again, those ease addicts are just wanting a place to stay. The travel addicts are wanting to be kind of nomadic and don't want to be tied down to any given place. Thus, they have a hard time finding or securing housing that would work for their particular style of living. And the excitement addicts that are looking for an adventure or a particular way of life. All right, let's talk about children. So children that live in poverty are going to be more likely to be hungry. They're going to have less educational prosperity. They're going to have more need for entering the workplace sooner and being part of possibly a family unit. They're going to be more likely to experience homelessness. They're going to be more likely to experience abuse or any kind of exploitation, etc. And there's a term called feminization of poverty, which is really just that poverty is concentrating a lot in the United States in women and in children. And that is a growing social problem. And that's essentially because of this need for a two-income household. And if so, if you're a single parent, or if you end up pregnant at a younger age, etc., you're going to have a harder time being able to adequately, economically provide for that household. And then again, we're going to talk about child support and the fact that because child support is, yes, necessary, but also there's are ways around it, and a lot of people that don't pay it, and a lot of people that get behind in it, et cetera, et cetera. However, when you talk about aid and assistance, all of that gets calculated into how much you can get in aid, whether or not it's being paid. If it is through the court system, more than likely it is going to be something that you are required to disclose, and that's going to work against your ability to get aid, even if you're not getting it. All right. So this is the percentage of these populations that live in poverty. Again, as a note in here, Indigenous people are not on this, and that their poverty rate generally hovers around, the general poverty rate hovers around 28%. But again, that is probably closer to 35% for Indigenous kiddos. And I would guess that might even be a low number, depending on the, again, just institutionalized amount of structural barriers that are there that get in the way of being able to access economic opportunities. And then down here, it's just kind of showing how for a long time prior to really talking about, as we talked about kind of in the elderly, talking about Social Security. Prior to Social Security, you had a lot more individuals um, in the elderly, in the elderly population that were in poverty line. That's leveled out and dropped considerably and then kind of leveled out due to, again, acquiring Social Security. And then your children's lines continues to go up. And so we've had a disconnect or a change in demographic of who particularly is in poverty in the United States. All right. Let's keep going. All right, we're going to finish out chapter 7 and then we'll be done with this lecture. This is it. When we talk about global poverty, we talk about residual poverty or the pockets of poverty within wealthy industrialized nations. So that's going to be essentially your poverty in the United States versus mass poverty, which is where most citizens live in extreme poverty, malnourished, chronically ill, die young, typically, and these are typically in places of that have less industrialized nations. So these are going to be in pockets where maybe malaria is still very present, or maybe AIDS are still an epidemic, or that there is an extreme amount of lack of resources due to ecological changes, etc. Economic colonialism is where capitalists from most industrialized nations strike a deal with the elite of, say, a government or something that reigns over a lot of people that are already having struggles generally, and they control the nation economically. And so this little infographic, I'm going to move me, is again something that shows kind of this desire or this way in which industrialized nations of the North really took away resources specifically from the southern regions and Africa, and left these countries in disarray and scrambling for economic prosperity. And then essentially they hold out hands as industrial nations and say, hey, we'll give you these loans that you're going to have a really hard time paying back. And we're going to cause all this destabilization. Here, help, you can figure it out. Good luck. And I could get into that for hours. However, we're going to kind of do that. But we're also, real quick, one more thing on economic colonialism. This shows all this economic wealth right sitting on the United States. But what it doesn't show is the massive amount of wealth and resources that were taken out of indigenous hands in order to create that wealth, and the ways in which they are still reaping consequences from those colonialistic powers and loss of land and loss of economic structures, loss of ways of life, etc. So moving forward, how do we move to a future that kind of does better for our societies? And really that talk, there's a couple different ways. You can have individual misfortune, or you can look at it with this structural inequality. And depending on how you look at it, you're going to look at the solutions very differently. If you're looking at it as a misfortune as through an individual, you're going to be like, hey, y'all, stop being lazy and get your stuff together. But if you really look at the structural inequality, you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, we need to figure out ways to give more people options and access to opportunities that allow for economic stability, not just blame it on those individuals. And then that's going to lead to progressive taxation, depending on, I think your book is talking about specifically taxation of wealthy and the progression that is taxation for individuals, individuals based on the economic bracket you fall into. And so it gets into a lot of how taxation works and what bracket you fall into equals what percentage of your income, etc., and what caveats you can get. And it's showing a lot of more taxation happening for that working and middle class versus those at the very, very top. And so really having that conversation. And then public assistance, so social insurance, teaching job skills, welfare, workfare, all these ideas that can possibly help, but depending on where you fall on how you think about poverty is going to be how and what you choose to support. Um, Private agencies and then faith-based programs that help with any kind of poverty or any kind of social need for those that are impoverished. But again, that's also going to come with they can be as picky as they want to be on who they're going to help and who they're not going to help, and what kind of structure inequality that's going to create. And then again, things like universal base income, raising the minimum wage, universal health care, affordable housing, affordable childcare. All of these things are things that are posed and things that have been researched and continue to be researched through sociology and economists. So if you have any questions about Chapter 7, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know it's a lot of information, but it is something that is important. And we will get back to this and kind of get through Chapter 12 and be done for this module.